Getting into the second half of the 20th century, we had the coming of, really in the wake of World War II, the repudiation of the most open practices of eugenics, of euthanasia, of mass sterilization. And at that time, we had people like Frederick Osborne, who were the head of the American Eugenics Society, who began to say, we can't force people anymore. It's not popular. We need to convince them that there are better, that it's in their own best interest, and we can use things like guilt and shame in order to convince people not to have kids that have problems. Sheldon Reed is the person who actually coined the term genetic counseling, and he did that when he was appointed as the head of the Dite Institute, which was an openly eugenic organization, which they referred to as an organization for racial betterment, etc. Here in Alberta, we had Margaret Thompson, who was on the eugenic board, also was the founder of the medical genetics department here at the U of A. And yes, Lulani, she did get the Order of Canada in 1988. I looked it up. And so it's interesting. Right now, the Canadian Society for Genetics each year gives an award for the best PhD thesis in genetics, and that's the Margaret Thompson Award. This is a person who authorized castration of people in order to use parts of their testicles for medical experiments, and was a major figure on the eugenics board. So today, like most of what is happening does not meet the strict sense of eugenics, in the sense that it's not manipulating the gene pool. For example, if somebody decides not to have a child with Down syndrome because of genetic counseling, that child is probably not going to have children of their own, and so it really has no effect on the gene pool. It's driven in part by our increased capacity to control life and death. As an example, right now there have been both Canadian and US studies that kind of look at deaths in the intensive care nursery. And the California one is the one that I'm most familiar with. And I'm not sure about the precise percentages, but basically 75%, roughly 75% of infants who die in a neonatal intensive care unit don't die in spite of treatment. They die because there's a decision made that it's the right thing for them to die at that time. And of those, you can divide it into cases where medical treatment is deemed futile. In other words, treatment is withheld, but it's well understood that even if treatment were given, that they would not survive for very long. And cases where treatment could be effective, but it's deemed that their quality of life is not adequate. And that's about 20% of the 70% of deaths. So because we have decisions to make, then we have to decide on what basis we're making those decisions. If we lived in a world where we didn't have the technology to keep people alive, we wouldn't have to make decisions about whether or not to keep them alive. Racial disparities exist, but I don't think that anybody would say that most of the practices that are out there today are designed to improve the race. Certainly, much of what's done is well-intentioned. I don't think that if there are any instances, there are certainly very rare instances of people who just have malice. I think there are instances where there's disagreement about whether it's really in an individual's interest or in a family's interest for people to die. Continued bias on intellect and a problematic, in my view, blur of the distinction between preventing a disease and preventing a person who has a disease. So you can pick any disease, like if you wanted to wipe out AIDS and you just said, let's carpet bomb Africa with nuclear weapons, that would end a lot of cases of AIDS. Okay? But I don't think we would think of that as a curative effect. In the same way, if we prevent the birth of a woman, women have a much higher rate of breast cancer than men have. But I don't think we would think of that as a prevention for breast cancer. But in many of these practices, what we do is we end up with the notion that somehow we've reduced the disease or cured the disease or prevented the disease by eliminating the people who might have it. In many cases, I think certainly my objections is not that people have choices to make, but the information given to them is incredibly biased. And so people are often given dismal pictures of the outcomes for their children. They're told that having a child with a disability has tragic effects on the family, that it does horrible things to siblings, etc. These are not things that are actually supported by real research. And yet we continue to give people information like that in order to make decisions that then we refer to as informed consent. And in many cases, what is being described by people is that when they actually refuse, that then they're told it's not their decision to make anyway. And it's particularly problematic when people are told, well, I think you should authorize this DNR order, or I think maybe we shouldn't go ahead with this treatment. And then they make a decision, and then they're told it's not really their decision to make, that they're being overruled by the physician, et cetera. Another tragic piece of this is that often people make those decisions thinking that they actually have control over them, and then later feeling guilty because they made a decision that they don't even realize was really somebody else's decision. Again, assisted suicide and euthanasia, I think, is another example where we refer to it as a rational choice, but the reality is it's not more or less rational than anybody else's decision to kill themselves. And I think if as a society, if what we want to do is we want to say suicide is okay, and anybody who decides to commit suicide, will assist them to do it, that may be reasonable. But where we say, if you happen to be a person with a disability or with a terminal illness, et cetera, we'll help you because we think that's rational. But if you want to kill yourself because your stock portfolio just dropped 75% in the last few weeks, we think that's irrational and we'll try to stop you. In fact, the only way that that's more rational is that we agree with the idea that that one person is better off dead and the other person isn't. So that's basically all that I want to say. I'll acknowledge my sponsors and tell you that some of this comes from an article that my colleagues and I have put together, and so I want to give Nancy Hansen and Heidi Jan some credit for some of this content, and thank you.